It's a great honour and a privilege for me to be here tonight with Lei to speak to you not just about her book, Cheng Lei, A Memoir of Freedom, but also to try to make some sense of her experience and understand what it means for the way we think about and engage with China. Certainly, Lei's story has received a significant amount of attention from government and in the media, and it folds into broader questions about Australia's relationship with China, which has gone through some significant transformations over the past decade and which will continue to evolve over years to come. My wife and I moved to Beijing in 2016 to take up a position at the Australian Embassy in Beijing. But it was through my wife's work at the Australian Chamber of Commerce that we first were introduced to the very lively, very excitable and very glamorous Lei, who quite regularly looked exactly as she does on the book. Her partner at the time, Nick Coyle, headed the chamber. We all became good friends, spending weekends together, visiting the Great Wall outside Beijing, eating and drinking out in Beijing's upper-end Sanlitun district, and making Chinese New Year dumplings with Lei's mum and her kids at her apartment not too far from where we lived in the Embassy district. At this time, China was undergoing, again, significant change. President Xi Jinping was leaving his stamp on Communist Party history, and China was asserting itself in the world through a more aggressive foreign policy. I remember at the time there was quite a bit of nervousness in the embassy as to where it was all headed. The job that I had in Beijing was in the embassy's political section. This also carried responsibility for human rights. So China's Ministry of State Security and its practice of residential detention in a designated location were all very familiar to me. But this all sat beneath the surface. It was part of the China that you didn't see, a place largely reserved for the damned few, human rights activists, political dissidents, traitors, and spent party cadres. A place for people that had crossed certain lines that were a far leap from your everyday activities in China, including for people like Lei. I thought I had a clear sense of these lines when I was in China, but this changed for me with Lei's arrest in August 2022. There had always seemed to be a separation between the surface you skim on as a visitor in China and the complex currents that ran underneath. They were two worlds that typically didn't collide. I'm quite positive that no one wants to experience residential detention at a designated location through personal experience, and both Chinese and foreigners alike tend to avoid behaviour that's going to land you there. But I'm also quite sure that the Ministry of State Security seeks to avoid scenarios where former inmates get to write tell-all books. But is all this changing? Should Lei's detention act as a warning for others? How do we go about engaging with China if that's the case? In Lei's case, I think it's important to remember that, at least from an Australian perspective, she's exactly what we wanted. A bridge between two different worlds, a shining example of the melding of two different cultures, identities and histories, a representation of the hope that perhaps China and Australia were not so different after all, that we shared things. China is an amazing place. It's full of amazing people, and we do share many things. But at the same time, it's a very different place, one that can be difficult to navigate and one that carries certain risks. I think in Lei's case, it's worth interrogating whether these risks were higher for her, having carried these dual torches, both for Australia and China. Indeed, it's a burden we ask many Australians of dual heritage to carry for us around the globe, and we shouldn't forget that. So with that, hi Lei. How are you?
I'm enjoying your spiel.
Yes, good to see you in the flesh. Let's start with me removing this page very quickly. And with your early life, you were born in China's Hunan province to modest means, to an academic father and a teacher mother, and you lived there until you were 10. What do you remember about China at that time?
I think people who have been to modern-day China would scarcely be able to imagine the China that I grew up in, the 70s and then the early 80s. There was a lot of deprivation, so I remember really wanting to taste bananas, but my mum said these precious few were for my elderly auntie who was hospitalized. So I never got to taste bananas until we were flying to Australia in 1985, and they're very cheap in Guangzhou. And chamber pots, firewood, having to use coupons. I remember, conversations between mum and dad about, we're out of cloth coupons, we can't, make new clothes for the new year, worries like that. It's a different world. An anecdote I heard from one of the first commerce ministers to visit France was that the whole delegation brought back a few croissants wrapped up in newspapers, because that's all they could afford back then, when China's whole forex reserves amounted to $3 million. So deprivation. And isolation. To give you an example, even in 1985, when my mum was trying to get the paperwork done for our visas to passports and then visas to Australia to join my dad, who was already here as a visiting scholar, she had to go to the Post and Telecom building and then wait for ages. And then somebody would tell her from one of the counters that my dad, that the line got through to my dad. And my dad took that inopportune moment to go to the toilet. So my mum's whole day was wasted. And this is just trying to make a phone call in 1985. And a lot of fears around relatives in other countries, because that had been a burden during the Cultural Revolution. And always this, I guess, even now people fear it, that what you say, what you do, if the government knew about it, then you would be in trouble. So people always check themselves. And nobody had private property. You needed to know whoever was allocating the housing in order to get your state allocated apartment. So deprivation, isolation, and then indoctrination. Even as a kid, I knew that I had to be the so-called the 3 good student in order to become a youth pioneer and get the little red scarf, very Soviet-like. And for then in high school, people are expected to join the youth league, and then of course, if you were good enough to join the Communist Party. And all the slogans, all the things on the PA system, all the news headlines, that's all indoctrination. So when you put those things together, what I went through in incarceration are very similar: deprivation, isolation, and indoctrination. So in that, China hasn't really changed. It's just the methods are now so sophisticated, and it's scary, because with China's prosperity comes the ultra surveillance that they can roll out through modern technology, and people actually believe in it a lot more because they think we are powerful. We can do things that other countries can't, the high-speed rail network and online payments, and then it's not even seen as indoctrination anymore.
Well, I'm sorry to say that you may have torched your opportunity to join the Chinese Communist Party.
I'll keep trying.
Yeah. So after 10 years old, you moved to Australia. 4 years into your time in Australia, events at Tiananmen Square unfolded before a global audience, and your family was allowed to stay as part of the government's amnesty program. Your father's always been a staunch critic of the Chinese government. How did moving to Australia in 1985 change your perceptions of China and what it meant to be a Chinese Australian?
Not just mine, but my parents as well, because they had all been brainwashed to think that everything outside China was terrible, and people in Taiwan were leading these very poor lives, and they were very shocked to discover that wasn't quite the case. And the evil capitalist countries were a lot more prosperous, and people were a lot happier than we were. So how I saw, obviously back then Australia was a lot more racist, so I didn't feel, especially in the early years, a sense that I could belong here. but I've made friends who were in my neighborhood. There were lots of Greek, Italian kids, and after I had learned English, they began to teach me things like what a skip was, what a wog was, what a chink was, and now it's seen as highly, politically incorrect, but back then it was just seen as sort of good-natured teasing, and it's the kindnesses, I think, that started to grow on me, and my parents would often reflect that, wow, here strangers help each other out instead of trying to, fleece them or trying, because in China, during the Cultural Revolution, you went through a decade of families backstabbing each other, divorces, because you had to denounce the spouse if they didn't come from the right family or if they had evil rightist thoughts. So to them, it was extremely moving when our car drove into a ditch on a camping holiday. Just a stranger in a ute just pulled up, helped us, towed us out and left. And when you carry those seeds of kindness in you, then you start to flesh out what it means to be in this country and to be Australian.
I think that's a really interesting point that I hear a lot, and sort of flow into my next question. But you go one direction, you arrive in Australia, you're not Australian enough, and we're about to sort of go into your return to China as a journalist, and interested to know whether when you got back to China you felt Chinese enough when you got there. But you returned to China in the year 2000. Initially in a career pursuing finance, and then you changed careers to journalism, and you got your foot in the door in 2002 with the English arm of China's state TV. You then did 9 years at the US network CNBC before coming back to Chinese state television in 2012. What were those first years as a journalist like, and what had changed, what had stayed the same since you left as a child?
As everyone knows, rapid change sort of defines modern-day China, and back in year 2000, it was a tremendously exciting time. China was just about to join the WTO, and everyone wanted to globalize, to liberalize. People who had studied abroad were seen more favorably as opposed to the attitude now. And where I initially started my expat career in Shandong province, there was a lot of anything goes corruption, as well as everything is possible entrepreneurship. That was very exciting. And after a steep learning curve, and after I changed careers, I found that I had found my calling in that the immediacy, the idea of making a change and being part of the change and being able to interpret it all for the global audience was just such a high. And the people's work ethic hadn't changed. It's just that they were compensated for their work now, as opposed to 40 years ago when my mum earned 48 yuan a month and nobody had real savings. So the fact that you have 1.4 billion people all working really hard together, it was just so much optimism, and people just want to lead better lives. And I had a great time covering a lot of business stories, but also learning about China and how the bureaucracy operates, which is, as you know, there's a lot of BS, but it's fascinating.
And look, that period, sort of turn of the millennium to 2012. That was a huge period for economic growth in China and economic liberalism. Was there any, sort of liberalism around practicing as a journalist, throughout the same period? Were we opening up a little bit? Were you getting a bit more freedom in how you reported? Or, you know, you're sort of showing up to work and, you know, someone from a department says, here's your story, print it?
Well, the hierarchy of censorship is such that Chinese TV is the most tightly censored because any Joe Blow can watch it, and followed by radio and then magazines, newspapers, and so on. And English media is actually treated with a much lighter hand because at first only foreigners could understand it. And then even the people who had good enough English to understand it, they were people with means and not likely to rebel. It's the have-nots that the government is afraid of. And the sensitive topics were what I call the 3 Ts, Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen, and then Falun Gong, the F, and then now X for Xinjiang. So in where I was working, as far as I can tell, because the censorship was such that there would be the reporter's script, and then I, as the foreign expert, would polish it, and they would finally be approved by a political editor. But as far as I can tell, the only things he changed were very minor. Like if you said mainland China, he always changed it to Chinese mainland, because to say mainland China denotes there is another China. Like, who really looks at these things, right? Yeah. And if you accidentally wrote, 5 countries, and then one of those 5 included Hong Kong, then you would have to change it to countries and regions. And of course, they don't say North Korea, they say the DPRK. And those are the 3 changes that I could tell that were made.
We were in Beijing together for the 19th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party in 2017. And this was a real watershed moment for China with the enshrining of Xi Jinping thought into the Communist Party constitution. And it really removed any remaining doubt that China was not going to liberalise politically in the same way it had liberalised economically. How did working as a journalist, in that 2017 and afterwards period change, and how generally did life change in Xi Jinping's new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics?
I think there were a few warnings before Xi came into power, a few turning points. When Google left, after that, people joked that to understand China, you have to go outside of China to be able to Google things. And also, people had been hoping that with the change in leadership, that things would get better. And initially, the coverage around Xi was, he was a man of the people. He went and had buns, and he made the bun shop very famous. And he was called Xi Dada, which is kind of like Uncle or Grandpa Xi. But that was the early part. And then he went to visit the headquarters of China State TV station and famously said that the media's surname is the party. And that's very Maoist in that sort of thinking. And we all sort of laughed, but weren't really laughing. And after that, you just started to see a lot of what's the word? The hero worshipping, putting Xi's name in everything, and every time he gave a speech, especially overseas, the requirements were that the reporters would go and interview different, especially white people, about what they thought of the speech. And of course, the implication is that they would be full of praise. And I always thought my job at CGTN was to make the show a little bit less bad each day and to delete Xi's name in everything because it was sickening. And then the jokes started to come out about China becoming West Korea, about Cultural Revolution 2.0, comparing the People's Daily in Mao's day to now Xi's day, and now actually there's a lot more worshipping going on now compared to Mao's time. So we were alarmed, but not super alarmed, as alarmed as we should have been, perhaps.
Okay, well, let's move to the main event. In August 2022, you were called to CGTN's headquarters in Beijing. 2020, my apologies, 2020, by your boss. But instead you were met with officers of China's Ministry of State Security. At the time, Australia's bilateral relationship with China was at a very low point, to say the least, and you were eventually told that you'd been arrested for sharing state secrets to foreign organisations. How much do you think your arrest was down to broader challenges in the Australia-China relationship, as opposed to any information you may have shared? And now that I've read that question, I feel like maybe I could have rephrased it to how much of this was your fault and how much of it was mine.
It's all your fault. They started surveilling me in April, right after our then foreign minister called for an independent investigation into the source of COVID. And it wasn't just me, it was other Australians as well. And I'm pretty sure that my apartment was bugged because of the way they raided it. They knew exactly where to look. And I think they arrested me at a time when I had just proposed a show about cooking and eating with ambassadors, and I was going to a few embassies, so that would have raised alarm bells. And the scope of interrogation was extremely wide. Everything from where restaurants I like to go to, who I went with to a certain bar on a certain night, to what I said in one of the WeChat messages, just constant questioning about who I was with and my thought processes, even to the extent questioning who I was closer to, my dad or my mum, to gauge my level of anti-China sentiment. So they were looking for things, and I think anyone in here, if you look for things, you can find things. And for some reason, I hadn't thrown out a document from May that was amid the messy sort of pile of papers on my desk. They took that, among other papers, but they used this particular report to form what they call the chain of evidence to convict me, and extracted false testimonies from my former colleagues, got a testimony from my then friend Hayes, and it could have been that, or it could have been something else, because it's a closed trial, defense attorneys are for show, so nobody stands a chance. And if you plead innocent, you will get a harsher sentence. So that's the individual against the state in China.
Was there any indication, was the broader relationship with Australia at the time ever mentioned to you, even in a blank?
The minute I mentioned it, they denied it profusely. Yeah. And that's when I thought, it must be that.
So it was your fault. Great, good to know. For people who aren't familiar with residential detention in China, I think it's worth explaining a little bit about how that process unfolded for you from the perspective of your interactions with the state's security apparatus and the judiciary. Can you offer any comments on that?
It's the reverse of what we do in the West. So there they torture you to extract the confession, and then they keep you in detention, and then going to jail, or the trial is just for show. And the torture, especially for Chinese citizens, is much worse. I've heard of people beaten for 12 hours until they die, sitting in these chairs where they can't touch the ground, sleep deprivation, just other vile things I can't even bring myself to mention. And this somehow, this torture somehow has the word residential in it. And I want to do my bit to have this sort of torture abolished.
You obviously speak about, the detention aspect and your time in RSDL in quite some length in your book. I'll skip past questions about food and accommodation. I think we can probably all assume it wasn't a highlight. But when you realised that your detention wasn't going to be for a day, a week, or even a month, how did you prepare for that?
When the realization sank in that there's no help, there's no way to tell people except for the 30-minute monthly embassy visit, I went to a very dark place. I was so tormented by the anguish. I wanted to end it all, but of course they make sure that the walls are soft and you are constantly, and I mean constantly, guarded by two people as well as the cameras. So there's no way you can escape the torment.
You mentioned her earlier, and she also features quite heavily, your friend Hayes. And I want to ask about it because I think many of us who've lived in China have or have had a Hayes, someone who's well-connected, ambitious, who pulls us towards situations where our better judgment tells us we shouldn't be. And these types of relationships highlight some of the challenges, particularly foreigners have, in engaging and doing business and other things in China. Certainly when I was there and others that were around us, we'd all imagined a line where behaviour is safe and then there's behaviour that can get you into trouble. Were there any red flags with Hayes that in hindsight you think you might have missed? Where do you think this line between safety and trouble lies? And what would be your advice to people in navigating this terrain?
I had known Hayes for years by the time I was arrested. We helped each other out regularly, sharing sources, contacts, intel. And it wasn't until I was reflecting on this in detention that I saw the red flags. For example, when she told me that she thinks, she had been warned by the Ministry of State Security, and also in the past few years, on two occasions when I didn't respond to her texts in a timely manner, she thought that I had been arrested by the Ministry of State Security, but she still kept pressing me for what she thought were scoops. That's what Bloomberg called it. And no other journalist friend did that to me. So I should have seen that. But as you said, I thought she's super ambitious, really good at her job, so focused. And I was benefiting from the information she gave me. I thought this was what journalists did, and bitching about the government. And I think we can't, in this environment, as in Xi's widened scope of state security, be sure where the lines are. And I suffered from that. I used to even kind of imply that the new foreign anchors who had just joined were so scared that they often censored themselves when it came to criticizing the government and making any remarks that were maybe even tamely out of line. I thought I knew, but the trouble with arbitrary detention and the authoritarian regime is that it can do what it wants. It can...
Arbitrary.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think you can fully guard against danger, but perhaps you can... I mean, I could have had a chat to Hayes and pushed back on her requests. and found out more about what consisted of state security these days, which quite frightening. Everything from an official's assets to a state-owned company's African subsidiaries, pollution. All this could, and I don't know, there was one fisherman who had been asked about the sighting of boats in the Taiwan Strait that cost him 3 to 5 years. So it's a different time.
Yeah. Were you treated differently in detention because you were an Australian citizen, or you sort of alluded to it a little bit before, but what was the difference in the way that you were treated versus some of the people that you were sharing a cell with that might not have held a dual passport?
Dual passport. There's no dual passport. Yeah. Heritage. I think there is this hierarchy of harshness. I think people who used to be in the state security system or foreign ministry are treated the harshest. They're seen as real traitors. And then people like me of Chinese origin, second, whereas the real Caucasians or non-Chinese people, what they do is seen as slightly more acceptable, regardless of what harm it does to the government. So there's a real personal aspect to it. And I think they really want to make examples of these people. You betray us, or even if it's not what we see as betrayal, but this is how we're going to treat you. And the treatment is all different. It's about who you are, whether your case is known outside, whether people still remember you, whether your embassy actually treats you with respect, and of course your level of cooperation, i.e. do you plead guilty and accept punishment.
Let's talk about the Australian government's response to your detention. If we accept that the bilateral relationship played a role, which I think we should, certainly, how should foreign governments respond to these scenarios? I certainly know from my experience in government that a relationship with a country like China is broad, it's multifaceted, and that part of the challenge, particularly with countries like China, is managing these relationships and balancing between competing objectives, whether that's trade and investment, security, treatment of citizens abroad. In your case, or others that you've seen the Australian government handle, I know that you've done quite a bit with Sean and Kylie around their detentions as well. Is the Australian government weighing these competing considerations appropriately?
I'm extremely grateful to all of the consular officers who came to visit me, all of the DFAT personnel who helped in advocating for better treatment and eventually for my freedom. And also super thankful to my media peers who kept my story fresh and from being forgotten. I also feel guilt that because I'm a mum, because I'm a woman, I might have attracted more public sympathy, and that shouldn't be so. I think the government, instead of trying to do something to help us, which of course they should, the priority should be deterring these arbitrary detentions from happening, and we could do that through thought-through approaches when dealing with such a powerful authoritarian nation like China. Do we do things unilaterally, or should we consult with allies? And after my detention, could we have got advice from, say, the Canadian embassy. They were just next door in Beijing, because they also had prisoners in there and they were trying to resolve the situation, a similar situation. And when it comes to advising families, is it always better to say, keep quiet and let diplomacy do its work? Or are there cases where publicity helps? I'm not saying sensationalist tabloid headlines. I'm saying a thoughtful approach to letting the public know this is the suffering, not just to the detainee, but to the family and the community. And if the public, want to speak up about it, then why is that a bad thing necessarily?
I remember the Canadian case, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, very, very well, because they were detained in 2018, while I was still in China, and that was a live conversation, a lot of the time, when we would speak about them and how to manage it, was, speaking publicly just going to sort of make things worse, or would pressure help, and it's certainly a difficult place to find a comfortable landing spot, I think. But as you say, the worst outcomes tend to be by the people who are forgotten about.
Yes, that's definitely the case.
I think I've got one more question, Colin, if you don't mind, and then we can kick on to Q&A, because I want to make sure that people have time to ask their own. How has this experience changed your perception of what it means to be Australian, what it means to be Chinese, and what it means to be an Australian of Chinese descent?
For a long time in detention, I went off things Chinese. Yeah. It just all made me sick. Having to watch the state news made me just really disgusted. And I was really saddened by the idea of boundaries and national borders. So in my case, it was a so-called Australian Chinese helping a Chinese friend who worked for an American organization, and that was so-called spying. And I would rather think of ideas like being universalist or humanist, and especially considering the events of the past few days, it's quite dispiriting to be human. And, we're safe, we're Australian, but other people who were born in a different land or carry a different passport should suffer such miseries. It makes no sense. And I think we all suffer. We can all be very kind, but the power of indoctrination and brainwashing cannot be underestimated. My cellmates, who were, I think, even some cases, more wronged than I was in detention, wronged by their own country, whatever that means, and yet they still wanted China, the mainland, to reunify with Taiwan, even if by force. They still thought that if their daughters came home with a black boyfriend, they would not accept it, as if that was some Chinese purity thing. So I don't know that to say you are Australian or Chinese, what exactly that means. I think to be human should be that we help each other and we can be kind.
Thanks very much, Lei.
Okay, and people would like to come down to the questions come out of the microphone. I think we're having one over here, two over here.
Hello. Hello.
Hello, thank you so much, Cheng Lei. I remember last seeing you in Beijing at an Australian embassy event and shocked at what had happened. I'm so sorry. I'm amazed at your endurance and resilience, and I wonder, after everything that you've been through and continue to go through, what sustains you?
I've been reborn. I went through days of forcing myself to think of my whole family dying. And I used to recite the Zen Buddhist mantra, life is full of suffering, everything's in flux. Only when you stop grasping can you have peace of mind. And I see life as much more a river now, and it's just passing through instead of trying to avoid pain or achieve happiness or achieve some goal. It's all life, and I'm unbelievably grateful to have been helped so that I was released in 2023 instead of this year or even further along. So I must make freedom count. I think sometimes we can be our own worst warders. Nobody's telling us, oh, don't do this, don't do that. But out of laziness, habit, some sort of, out the mind confinement, we don't do things. And the minute you are behind bars, you will be full of regret. So I always tell people, go and just say yes to everything and do it right now and make freedom count. Otherwise, what's it all for?
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys for a very interesting evening. Ms. Cheng, at the Defending Australia conference, Acting Prime Minister Miles was asked if he would denounce China as a threat to Australian freedom, and he wouldn't do it. Do you think this is a responsible or irresponsible position from our government?
What he says and what the government does are different things, no?
Sure, but don't you think that the difference between denouncing a country like China and not denouncing a country like China makes a difference in practice, even though it's just words?
But you can also play it out. Given this 24/7 global news cycle, what's that going to lead to? And do we want our trade, our people to be affected? We have to think through the consequences. We can take a measured tone instead of saying things that we can't really act on. If we say they are a threat, what do? I think it's much more important for us to understand how China does trample on human rights and to help people who are affected than to say, oh, okay, we got Richard Marles to admit something.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cheng Lei. I'm very interested in your thoughts. Some of us get invited to conferences in China by various universities and so on. What considerations would you advise us as we get such invitations? What are the factors that might influence us to accept them or not accept them? What are the pros and cons, or what are the issues that you might think we should take into account?
I think China is very good at hospitality, showing you such a good time that you perhaps are swayed towards their system or their way of thinking, and then even unconsciously starting to defend everything they do. I think if you can actually work with people who are able to have candid conversations about what China does in dark corners, then it's very worthwhile. But having said that, you don't want to endanger anyone. So it's about not letting yourself be used, because China loves a photo op. You know, Australian academics, Australian delegation visit us, and, you know, we celebrate our cooperation and our enduring friendship. And to them, that is their KPI for exporting soft power. And to the extent that that solidifies their regime stability, then it's perhaps a little distasteful. But what are you getting out of it? Are you able to exert your, you know, soft power and, you know, share what you know of Australian values and how much we care about individual freedom as well as the stability of the society, because the individual is really sacrificed in a regime like China and even other East Asian nations. They're just seen as unimportant. Thank you.
Cheng Lei, thanks very much for a very interesting outline of your experiences. Could you just flesh out your story about Hayes a bit more? I take it from what you said that this person was a journalist with Bloomberg, and that you took this person to be responsible for your detention. What were the circumstances of this journalist? Were they was it a journalist who'd come for Bloomberg's from overseas to a posting in China, or was it someone who had been planted by the Chinese authorities? What were their motivation? Were they blackmailed, or were they an agent? What was the sort of circumstances around that?
Definitely not an agent, and China's requirements for foreign journalists are that they must be foreign. So because she held a Chinese passport, she could only do the work of a journalist, but not be hired as a journalist. And even though she broke lots of stories for Bloomberg and was paid very well, as the officers kept telling me to get me to be jealous, she was only called a news assistant or news staffer. And it's just a personality thing. I mean, she came from Chinese TV royalty, and in fact, it's my understanding that her parents pulled strings to get her out much earlier than otherwise, to the extent that Bloomberg took out a whole-page ad in the New York Times on World Journalism Day in 2022, advocating for her release, only to be slapped in the face the next day by China's foreign ministry saying she's happily living at home with her mum. So that's how arbitrary China can be.
Hi, Cheng Lei. My question is very simple. Would you still recommend China as a place to travel?
I got asked this in December 2023, and my answer was, would you believe me would you take my advice if I said yes? As the same as the, visiting China for conferences. It's all up to the individual to decide your risks and what you gain out of it. I think China, scenery, food, experiences can be all wonderful, but at the same time, you can leave your mark. You can, have conversations with people and not just do the opposite, which is to come back to Australia and say, oh, China's great, China's got high-speed, railways, and I had the best time in China, and, it's not as bad as people say. Because China's so big and complicated, and everyone can have an utterly different experience. But that's why we should know more about China, and we should cover it better as journalists.
I'll just add my thanks again so much for talking to us. I was going to ask about something a little bit more recent, which was last year, the visit from the Premier and the events that unfolded for you. Because I just remember seeing at the time, you looked so incredibly calm, and especially given what you've just described, your experience being incarcerated in China. I just wonder how you looked so calm at the time, and sort of what you were thinking when that was happening.
I think their actions were, in a way, predictable, because they are all about face but have no shame. And to them, blocking me, making fools of themselves in front of an international audience, but successfully keeping me from the feed to China, which is all that matters for their jobs and careers. That's all they care about. And that the foreign ministry can tell porkies, like the next day at the briefing, and say, we did not know about this, when I saw with my own eyes in that Canberra press briefing room the foreign ministry spokesperson, Wang Wenbin, tell his underlings to block me. Yeah, what do you expect? So I don't think outrage is either effective or, yeah, it's just, unfortunately, that's how they are.
I think we have time for one more question. Come up.
Okay, hi, thank you so much for your talk tonight. It's very inspiring. So I really like how you said, like, you should view Chinese people and the China as a country differently. But I'm just wondering how you view, like, the general Chinese public today. Like, they were so indoctrinated since they were born, and it's like their education is so different from us. So what's your experience like working with people who are like indoctrinated since like a really young age? And is there any hope to change how Chinese act and how they are like praising their country now, right now? Or is there like any way you can change it and change like how they think of the government?
I think there's a lot of sentiment in China that we don't know about. For example, China has approximately 20,000 protests a year that we don't know about. And of course, anything that could lead to another Tiananmen is quickly quashed. But we can't discount the fact that people can be quite discerning when it comes to information, and we should be doing better ourselves. Because right now, I think China and the propaganda machine are having a field day with what's happening in the US and perhaps other countries. So as much as we can, still do our thing well, speak up about justice and freedom and uphold integrity, I think change is natural. Like when we came here, and my parents were just blown away by how much you could criticize the government and its leaders, and how little money they made and how little power they had. And that's something that, this is why, for second generation Australian Chinese, it is much, you don't even have to say anything or do anything. They just take on the values because they see it, they feel it, they breathe it. But if we fall to pieces, then that's our fault.
Is this the one? No, I knew that'd be my luck. Hang on. Hello, everybody. My name's Tom Connell. I'm at Sky News, so a colleague now of Leigh's. I'm giving the vote of thanks. I'm not sure if it's just me. Often when I read non-fiction, I have this habit of imagining myself in the situation. In one sense, it was pretty fast-fetched because, yes, I'm a journalist, but the worst I cop is maybe the Prime Minister skipping over me during a press conference in a courtyard, so I wouldn't compare myself. But I have 2 young kids, so I felt myself reading Leigh's book and thinking, what would I do in this circumstance? Would I have had that calmness? And essentially every single time the answer was no, I would have failed pretty miserably. So I tried to stop doing that and just immerse myself in the book. Nonetheless, if I think about those circumstances and how Lei was, her sense of humour in some of these moments, in any moment, and I really mean any, you know, the torture chair, a full body examination, there was a sense of humour there. Often it had to be internal as well, and this was the hardest part. There was no one there often to laugh at a joke. Sometimes she'd catch a guard off guard and manage a joke, but still the sense of humour was there. The calmness under interrogation, no matter how outrageous the claim might have been from her guards, the genuine Orwellian nightmare she was sort of in, and being able to always see the bigger picture, whereas I'm pretty sure I would have got myself another 2 or 3 decades at some of the things they were doing. The diplomat as well, an extraordinary ability, even at times when she was with cellmates who perhaps sometimes not even through their own fault were pretty deranged, and she was always able to say, well, we've all got to get along, I need to be the bigger person, whereas again, I'm pretty sure I would have been one of the deranged cellmates, not helping the situation. And as well, just her determination to maintain in some way a sense of self, a sense of herself as a human in what is ultimately attempting to be a dehumanising environment, keeping her spirit alive, whether it be there are dumplings served. She hasn't seen dumplings for a year and dumplings are served. And even her recognising in that moment, I am getting joy out of this. There is a human alive within me waiting for this moment of joy. Look, there's a vegetable that hasn't been sort of steamed to within an inch of its life and still able to have that joy out of that. And then thinking, how else can she do that?
Still have onion PTSD.
And that turned into song lyrics, and suddenly she's leading a very unusual choir of somewhat at times reluctant cellmates in whether it be Auld Lang Syne or 80s rock classics. And again, I know I would have failed because I was thinking, how many songs do I know the words of? And mainly they're Blink-182, and I don't think that would have gone down all that well in cell life. Even the writing of the book itself and the complete openness about Leigh's account. There is nothing edited. There's a refusal to sanitise the experience at all, which is so crucial in this type of account where you might think, maybe I'll leave this part out about me, but she says, nope, that's going in because it is part of the incarceration, every part of that experience. And all the while as well, her analytical brain keeps ticking, analysing the insecurities of her guards on a micro level, but also a macro level. And you would have heard her a lot tonight around the Chinese Communist Party and everything that leads to their need to lock someone up on these trumped up, ridiculous charges. There's the irony in herself writing such a fascinating and captivating book, which she would have swapped probably a limb for during some of those relentless hours in jail, because what sustained her reading this book, children and family, no doubt, and what she wanted to go back to. But she spoke about, she couldn't think about her children too much because that would be too painful an existence, because that would consume her. So much came back to books, biographies, sci-fi, poetry, a 700-page book on interest rates. So maybe if Michelle Bullock doesn't do a good job, there's another opportunity there. I'm not sure how many people in the world would have read that book. And again, I have some mild understanding of that. If I'm sitting on a train, I don't have something to read, I go mad. But 700 pages on interest rates, I might have tapped out on that one. Even writing chapters of not this book but other books in her own head just to keep her sanity about her. And then the final thing I thought about was the real life insight of Lei. Having now read the book, I realised that moment that one of the questioners alluded to with those Chinese embassy staff here at Parliament House, back here on Lei's turf in Australia, in the House of Democracy. There's a visit of a premier, and still she's being hounded, really, harassed, after all the false allegations, the imprisonment, the humiliation of the way she was treated in China. There they are again. And yet here's Lei, pen in hand, paper in hand, just with a wry grin, a slightly quizzical look at it all, as if to say, you didn't break me then and you're not going to break me now. Having read the book and then re-seeing those pictures, it really brings home her ability to take the higher road, I suppose, to a degree, and always see it for what it is. And I think that's probably what allowed her to, not that any part of what she endured would have been easy at all, but that the way she managed to endure it so well. So they were my reflections on reading what is a great book. So if you haven't bought a copy already, there are more available, I believe, Colin. You can get a signature from Lei. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'll let you get out and enjoy the rest of the book signing. Thank you.
Thank you.